we are looking at part 4 of building a high-level creative strategy. If you haven't listened to part 3 or 2 or 1, might be good to go back and listen to those. They're somewhere on Spotify, Apple, wherever you're at. But we are looking today at the process where the creative strategist has completed the initial brief, has shared it with the client if the client wanted to see it, and they're moving into handing it off to the graphic designer. Now, I want to start by focusing on something that we have built out within the agency as a new process, which is technically month 2 on. It's not really necessarily month 1 because you've already talked to the client in the kickoff call, so they relatively know where things are. But one bottleneck that we continued to see when it came down the road to creative approvals from clients, which will be in the next episode, I believe, was delays and just taking time for them to get back to us, which on part was on us because we were just giving them creatives the day they were done with no notice. So what we've added in now within our process is when we know that production is going to start on X date and we know that production should be done by X date, we will send a proactive email 1 to 2 weeks in advance to a client, just giving them a heads up on the production timeline, letting them know that we're moving into production and that they should expect to review creative and get it back to us within this 2 to 3 day window as well. Mm-hmm. And it's been very beneficial. There's one specific client that you worked with that targets moms that always gave us, kind of a run around there, which it has vastly improved that client. So I'll just give you testimonial. It's a process that's working for us.
Awesome.
So, but what we're looking at here in month 1 is where can we go for handing off the actual brief to the creator or to the graphic designer, and what does that look like? Now, when it comes to communication for handing off the brief, do you prefer a call? Do you prefer putting it in a project management tool? Where do you generally sit with this?
So in terms of handing the brief over to the designer, if the designer is fairly new and it's like a new working relationship, then definitely for quite a considerable amount of time, because the creative strategist and the designer need to be speaking the same language. And sure, of course, from an efficiency perspective, you want to get to the point where as the creative strategist, you can hand your brief to the designer and they can execute it. But that doesn't happen overnight. That working relationship, that working language of creative strategist with designer takes time. And you can have as many processes and as many acronyms as specific to the agency as you want. But that's just, I feel, a pure relationship thing between designer and creative strategist. Just invest the time, have the meetings up front with a new working relationship and get it right. But after that point, you absolutely, I would say anyway, want to be in a position where you can just hand a brief to your designer and they'll know what to do with it. Even for new clients, it shouldn't really matter. Now, the one kind of exception to that, I would say, is with creative, especially if it's in-house graphic design stuff and not UGC stuff, there's going to be specific themes that you're following, right? And that is absolutely part of the language. So we're going to do a creative theme that is us versus them. We're going to do a creative theme that is a benefits call out. We're going to do a benefits theme, which is simple, powerful text overlay. And that's what I mean with the language is you want your designer to know what you mean when you say powerful text overlay. So that's kind of really important. Also super important giving examples. So I have 4-play boards for all of the creative themes that I use all the time. And I would always give the 4-play board to the designer alongside the name of the theme. So even if we're speaking the same language, even if he knows what it is, I still give him visual examples. But the one time I would say you should absolutely get on a call, even if you're 6 months, a year into that relationship with the designer, is if you're introducing a new creative theme that you've not done before. And like I said, even with themes that I've done with my designer hundreds of times, I still give them my 4-play board. But if it's a brand new theme, I wouldn't just give a 4-play board and expect them to know how I want that to be translated for this client. So if there was a new theme that came in, good example of this is once we tried out, we wanted to do like a retro catalog style creative. So it looked like a magazine kind of catalog from like the 1970s with like, wow, look at this. And like, you're going to look great in these sunglasses and, that kind of thing where you could show a few different products, quite copy heavy because you're making it look like a catalog. And so that, I gave him examples and I like verbally talked him through what I wanted. I was on a call with him explaining, sharing my screen and giving him examples. And even then he gave me something back that I was like, this is nothing like what I wanted, even with a call. But when you're doing new things like that, like new innovative themes and designs, allow a lot more time. And I'd say my top tip is do not do new creative themes in the first brief for a brand new client. I would just flatly avoid it. But yeah, I would say only have a call if you've got new stuff coming in that the designer's not familiar with.
Yeah, and part of it too comes down to for anybody listening that's a creative strategist, like what do you expect from the designer you're working with, right? Because we've had various designers within the agency. Our current designer we're working with, we incorporate him in the actual briefing process. So we bring him in to bring ideas. And one thing that we implement, now we're talking client one, brief is due by Friday. He's working on it Thursday. That's it. But we also have proactive calls that we set up once. It's a morning call every Monday to align the creative team, but also a bi-weekly call where we look at different tests that we could run in accounts and insights that we could gain, where everybody's collaborating and communicating. And we expect different people to bring different things or different opportunities to that call. They can have input on the creative as well there. And I think it really depends on how proactive and just how in tune your designer is with e-commerce or just with paid media that way. Totally. And if they truly love it and if they truly specialize in it, they're going to be bringing ideas and they're going to be bringing opportunities to you to where they can take your idea and even elaborate on it and make it better than just the original idea that there was.
Yeah. Definitely. And we've talked about this before, I think quite a bit as well. Like someone who's really passionate in this space will move that department forward at knock's speed. And it makes the job of the creative strategist so much easier when you've got a designer like, oh, I saw this cool ad and I think it's going to be really great for that mum brand or, whatever. And you as the creative strategist is like, sweet, that's one less like innovative idea that I've got to come up with. And that's definition of team ultimately.
Yeah. And let's go into that a little bit more. And I guess ultimately it would depend on how proactive or how dedicated your designer is to that niche, the specific paid media channel, but allowing free reign versus following a brief very strictly. Of course, there's times when you're a creative strategist that you're going to create an idea and it needs to be executed the way that you're saying because it needs to communicate the message that way. But how do you feel about kind of the free reign versus, just having a brief strictly followed?
I think it depends, I guess, on the process leading up to it, because if the designer's been quite involved with putting together the brief, then they're probably going to know things like, right, we can't say free if we include that product. So we'll need to think about the design of this one. We can't have that product image with the word free. That's kind of tripped us up a couple of times before. Or if the brand is really specific about color and the designer feels like, oh, this color is going to be better, again, should be in the creative preferences in that creative one pager we mentioned in the last episode, but these things do get overlooked. So what I tend to say is like, I personally would like the designer to follow what I've put in the brief, but if they've got an idea, like just pick up the phone, give me a ring, like ping me on Slack and just say, hey, have you got 5 minutes? I've got a really cool idea for this brief. Because what I don't want to do is miss any opportunities to make our creatives more exciting, more innovative. As a creative strategist, I'm not a specialist in graphic design. The graphic designer is going to be able to execute my vision way better than I ever would be able to. So I do not want to obviously restrict any freedom or any kind of innovation or like thought leadership there. But at the same time, I don't want the designer to just run with his idea because it might directly conflict with something that I've either put in there strategically or that I know from the last call with the client that they didn't want. And if the designer goes ahead and does that without having a conversation, then we've got to put the design back into the creative studio again for amends. And you can literally lose a day sometimes with that, depending on what time zones your team are on. Whereas if you'd have just picked up the phone and gone, hey, I've got this idea. Can I change that color to this? Or can that text be that? Or did it have to be this for a reason? And let's just deal with it then and there. And therefore you kind of get the best of both. You don't restrict a creative from being better if it can be better, but you don't go into unnecessary amends.
Yeah, and I think communication, it's such a simple term, but just proactive communication is the key. We talk about it with clients. It's so important with team as well, just making sure that there is proactive communication on both sides, because you don't want to deliver creative to a client and it mismatches their expectations. But as a designer, you don't want to deliver creative to the creative strategist, because the creative strategist has a hard job. They have to be a team player. They have to allow for innovative designs from the designer and things like that. But they're also like a blocker from client feedback. You know what I mean? Like, and it's the creative strategist's job to know the client very, very well. Of course, the designer needs to know the brand guide and those things, but the creative strategist also has to know the business goals, and they have to know the objectives of campaigns and the client preference and the client rapport and all that stuff as well.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a hurdle for a creative strategist to navigate that feedback and make sure that we're not burning out designers from having creative liberties, but also achieving specific things that need to be done performance-wise.
Yeah, and you're right. And that is such an important point, I think, from not restricting designers to have like that creative flair that, I mean, I'm not a designer. I don't have much creative flair in my body at all. But I think I can imagine if I did, it would be quite soul destroying to be in a job where that creative flair wasn't allowed to break out and be present, and you weren't allowed to flex that. That would be so demotivating, so disheartening. Like I wouldn't ever want to. And I think it comes down to culture. It comes down to like team culture and the department, whoever's running that department, what culture they're leading in that department. Like, is there space for innovation? Is there space for ideas? Is there space for that creative strategist or the leader of the team to be wrong? Because I want my designer to come to me and say, I think we could do this better if I did it this, but it's completely different to what you asked for. If I'm like, no, got to sit with my idea, that's going to foster that's going to cut off any innovation going forwards. But if I'm like, oh my God, I love that, yes, please do it, then you're creating that culture of this is an ideas-led department, bring me your ideas. That's how we all win.
And how failure can happen there, and how it can turn into the creative strategist has to do that, but then it just drags on. As for that relationship to succeed, the designer, like we've been saying, has to have interest and desire and passion for that specific type of design, because then their ideas are going to be angled to succeed on that channel. Whereas if you have somebody that is a newsletter designer or a logo designer or a brand designer that is focusing on paid media creative, they might have great ideas, but they might not be great ideas for paid media. So then there's always going to be conflicting. So then they're always going to be having their ideas shut down. So then they're just going to start shutting down. And if they're not proactively coached or trained or moved into a different role or out of the agency, then it's just going to burn things out.
I had that exact situation. And it was really hard because I value culture in my teams over like pretty much anything and everything, because that's how you get the best out of people. And it was really hard. And he kept coming to me with ideas that weren't right for paid social. And I would take the time to explain to him why, and like spend the time to try and, coach and lead down different paths and stuff like that. But ultimately the passion for paid social just wasn't there. And so the ideas that he brought continued to be not good for paid social, like too text heavy, not eye grabbing enough, like, just kind of some of the basics really that direct response creative needs to have. Like those elements were missing. And it's not that I wasn't ever willing to test. A few of them we did test, and we did proper A/B tests, and it was like, luckily we had a good enough culture where it was my creative versus his creative, but in a really fun, collaborative, competitive way. And my creatives always win. Yeah. But I think that is super challenging. And it comes back again to having someone passionate in that design seat, because they will bring to you ideas that are relevant to like you said, to the channel and to the industry.
Yeah. And if for anyone listening that's a creative strategist, agency owner that's curious, like, do we have the right designer? Do we have the right team member? But in this case, we're talking designer. Don't mean to put designers in a hole here, but the idea.
Same for copywriters, exactly the same for copywriters. Like I've had that exact challenge as well, where it wasn't a direct response copywriter, and I've struggled to get direct response copy. And that's another really challenging thing to nail.
And what I'm about to say here could apply to copywriter, graphic designer, creative strategist, whatever, right? It applies to any role, but this can be a good indicator. I feel like I've learned to understand if you have the right person in the right seat is when you share a brief, when you share a company objective update that impacts someone, when you share something on a call, when you share something to the team and there's no questions, that's a very scary thing, right? Because no questions can mean, not always, but can mean that they just don't have the background experience or comprehension to want to know why we're going to do something a certain way, or why we aren't doing it a different way that they think we should, because they've done it in the past that way.
Yeah.
Right.
Or to challenge it, like with a different idea, or to be like, wow, I've never thought about it like that. How did you come up with that idea? Like having interest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No questions could be burnout, could be wrong person, wrong seat. Like that is if you're sharing quarterly goals or things like that, and there's no questions, like that's scary. That's a very scary thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say definitely look out for that. I think that, we've had a good conversation on this so far, looking at how we go about communicating briefs to designers.
Yes.
What have we missed?
There was one thing, actually, sorry, I went, as always, on that tangent specifically around communication, but you asked at the very start, the second part of the question was about what kind of briefing templates or briefing structure that I like to use. So this is actually something I built working with you, as you know, at Brighter-Click. I actually created a system in Airtable with drop downs, basically, to help make sure that an ad is constructed with all of the psychological elements that really should be present. So we've talked about this in previous episodes, obviously, as part of putting together the strategy, how important it is to include motivators that are linked to behavioral psychology, so that you can make sure you're tapping into the desires of the audience, etc. But it doesn't really just stop there. You can do your testimonial analysis, really nail the pain point, like have the exact pain point that is going to trigger someone into a purchase decision. But that isn't really enough. Not anymore anyway, in terms of cutting through the noise and converting attention. So what I've also added into my system now as well is I've added marketing frameworks. So things like Problem-Agitate-Solution, attention, interest, desire, action, so that we can make sure when we're looking at the creative as a whole, we're not just talking about the pain point, but is there an opportunity to add some social proof there? Is there an opportunity to add an incentive or an offer there? Is there something else we should be doing other than just saying this one pain point? Having one pain point on a creative is way better than probably like 50% of the creatives I see in my newsfeed that kind of goes on like weighted blanket that weighs 8 kilograms with glass beads. Those are the really poor ones. Make it more pain point focused, make it more desired outcome, tap into that behavioral psychology, you're already a step ahead. But if you're then adding marketing framework layer on top of that, so Problem-Agitate-Solution or AIDA, those types of things, you're leveling up again. And this doesn't have to be limited to video. Sure, these kinds of frameworks are really great for plotting out scripts for content creators, etc. But you can also do it with your static images. You could have like the problem on the text overlay on the creative, you can have the agitate on the headline, the copy, and then you can have the solution in the first 3 lines of copy at the top. So when you think about it like that and you implement marketing frameworks as well, you've got this all-encompassing ad where every single part, not just the creative, is working hard for you to get that conversion. And if you don't have the right briefing structure and the right briefing template, you will overlook those types of opportunities. So yes, I think briefing templates and briefing structures are really, really important to make sure you are completely maximizing your ad experience as a whole for the end user to get the outcome that you want as the brand.
So important. And that brief, if you go into the QC process for creatives, once the designer has given it to you, which is going to be the main focus of our next episode for this series, and you're off and you feel like something's missed, you need to go back to the brief and say, was it the brief or was it the team member? Like, is it the process or is it the person, right? The brief is the central communication point. So if you don't have the right briefing structure, like Charlie was saying, if you don't have the right templated design for your brief and the right communication pathway, you will have production timeline delays, which a day for each client may not sound dramatic or drastic, but it really is. It really
adds up. 100%. Yeah. No, that stuff adds up so quickly.
This is it for part 4. Is this part 4? 1, 2, 3, 4. This is it for part 4.
When you said part 4 at the beginning, I was like, how is he remembering this? He's definitely going to forget. And then
This is it for part 4 of the series, Building a High-Level Creative Strategy. As I shared just now, we're going to be going over the overall QC process and handing over the creative to the client for the next episode.